Welcome to the Critical Thinking Workshop. We will begin with the first part of this three-part series with the elements of thought. Here are a few questions we can ask ourselves before we delve deep into what is critical thinking and the elements of thought. Are you, in any real sense, in control of your thinking? How do you control your thinking? Have you ever discovered a significant problem in your thinking and then changed it by a conscious act of will? Do you know how to test your thinking? If anyone asked you to teach them what you have learned thus far in your life about thinking, would you really have any idea what that was or how you learned it? These are questions we want to think about as we go through this three-part series on critical thinking. Thinking. Why concern ourselves with critical thinking? Everything we know, believe, want, fear, and hope for, our thinking tells us. Yes, our thinking tells us what there is, what is happening, what our problems are, what our options are, what threatens us, what is important and what is unimportant, who our friends are, who our enemies are, what our history is, who we are, and who loves us. Thinking determines what we learn, how we learn, what we think is important to learn, what effort we should expend, what we think is true, what we think is false, how things should be viewed, whether our learning is of high or low quality, whether our learning is deep or superficial. This is why we want to know what is thinking and its benefits. We consider three levels of thought. Level 1 is the lower order of thinking. It's unreflective, it's low to mixed skill level, it frequently relies on your gut intuition, it's largely self-serving and self-deceived. Lower order thinking is often distinguished from higher order thinking, but higher order thinking can be inconsistent in quality. It can be fair or unfair. Therefore, to think at the highest level of quality, we need not only intellectual skills, but intellectual traits as well. Part 2 of this series covers intellectual skills, and Part 3 covers intellectual traits. Level 2 is our higher order of thinking. It is selectively reflective. It lacks critical thinking vocabulary, and it can be inconsistently fair. Level 3 is our highest order of thinking. It is explicitly reflective. It uses routine thinking skills routinely, and it is consistently fair. Your thinking can either trap you or free you. Trap you means it can hold you hostage within uncritically held beliefs, or it can free you and open your mind to new ways of thinking. Let's ask ourselves if the quality of our work is given in the thinking that we do about our work. So now we're moving from thinking to critical thinking. What is it? Why is it important? How does it improve teaching and learning? Critical thinking is the art of analyzing and assessing thinking in order to improve it, the awakening of the intellect to the study of itself, a system of thinking that opens up all other systems of thinking. Critical thinking is a self-directed process by which we take deliberate steps to think at the highest level of quality. Critical thinking is not something you add onto everything else. Rather, critical thinking is the way you do everything you do. Critical thinking is disciplined, self-guided thinking aimed at living a rational life. It's thinking that analyzes thinking. It's thinking that assesses thinking. It's thinking that combats its native egocentricities. And it's thinking that develops within itself intellectual habits. Reasoning is the process of drawing conclusions or figuring something out. Reasoning involves the elements of thought. Reasoning consists of standards for reasoning. We call them intellectual standards, and they are covered in part 2 of this series. Reasoning involves the traits of a disciplined mind. We call those intellectual traits or intellectual virtues, and they are covered in part 3 of this series. When the elements of our reasoning adhere to intellectual standards, then we exhibit intellectual virtues. These 3 components are the central topics of this 3-part series. The elements of thought. Whenever we think for a purpose with a point of view based on assumptions leading to implications and consequences. We use data, facts, and experiences to make inferences and judgments based on concepts and theories in attempting to answer a question. These 2 sentences sum up the elements of thought: purpose, question at issue, information, interpretation and inference, concepts and theories, assumptions, implications and consequences, and point of view. All of these elements of thought are summed up in these 2 sentences. One element of thought is concepts, theories, definitions, laws, principles, and models. We can use a simple model for constructing knowledge. At our center point of our concept model, we have substantive learning. The foundation of substantive knowledge is defined by primary concepts, an element of thought. Each and every field of study is based on primary concepts. You read it, you hear it, you write it, and you draw it. Then you apply it and teach it. What is the relationship between content and thinking? The only way to understand anything is through thinking. Content is understood by thinking, constructed by thinking, modified by thinking, applied by thinking, questioned by thinking, and assessed by thinking. Therefore, to learn content, you have to think it into your thinking using your thinking. Critical thinking provides the tools needed to think through the content. Let's look at 3 other elements of thought that are closely related: assumptions, presuppositions, axioms, taking for granted, information, including data, facts, observations, and experiences, and then inferences or interpretations, which include conclusions and solutions. At the top level, we have the conscious level of thinking. Information from a situation leading to inference, which would be the conclusion. Beneath this conscious level of thinking, we have assumption, unconscious level of thinking. Here are a few examples. The first one, for information, the situation, you see a man with a black eye. The inference or the conclusion is he has been hit by someone. The assumption made is that people who have black eyes have been hit. Let's look at another one. Number 4. You see a child crying next to her mother in a grocery store. The inference or conclusion is the mother has hurt the child. The assumption for this is whenever a child is crying next to her mother, she has been hurt by her mother. Think about that and how information, the situation, is related to inference, the conclusion, and how our assumptions must be accurate. The critical thinking mind is equal to the educated mind. To learn anything, you must actively bring it into your thinking. Consider this exercise to think for yourself. One-on-one beginning to think about your thinking. To begin to think about your thinking, make a list of any problems you believe currently exist within your thinking. Try to be as explicit as possible. The more problems you identify, the better. For each problem you identify, complete the following statements. One problem with my thinking is, this is a problem because if I adequately address this problem, the quality of my life would improve in the following ways. Here is another exercise to try. Critique your thinking. Consider your thinking in these domains of your life: at work, in personal relationships, in teaching, in intimate relationships, as a reader, as a writer, in planning your life, in dealing with your emotions, and figuring out complex situations. From these perspectives, complete these statements. Right now, I believe my thinking across all domains of my life is of what quality? I base this judgment on what criteria? In the following areas, I think very well. In the following areas, my thinking is okay, not great, but not terrible either. And then also consider the third point. In the following areas, my thinking is probably of low quality. List at least 3 areas from the first paragraph and apply it to this exercise. Critical thinking is not new. In 1605, Francis Bacon wrote the first book on critical thinking. The Advancement of Learning, in which he documented various forms of human irrationality and the need to establish new habits of thought through education. What about Socrates, 2,400 years ago, discovered by a method of probing questioning that people often cannot rationally justify their confident claims to knowledge. So critical thinking is not new. In closing, you are welcome to use this checklist. Number 1, all reasoning has a purpose. Think about the purpose in doing X. All reasoning is an attempt to figure something out, to settle some question, to solve some problem. Use the checklist to state the question to be answered. Number 3, all reasoning is based on assumptions. Here, identify your assumptions. Number 4, all reasoning is done from some point of view. Here, write your point of view. Number 5, all reasoning is based on data, information, and evidence. Gather your information and document it. Number 6, all reasoning is expressed through and shaped by concepts and ideas. Clarify your concepts. What is the main idea of what you are working with at this time? Number 7, all reasoning contains inferences or interpretations by which we draw conclusions and give meaning to data. Align your inferences, your interpretations, and your conclusions with the data you have gathered. Finally, all reasoning leads somewhere or has implications or consequences. Double check the implications of your conclusions. So I offer this checklist to you to help you walk through the elements of thought, the elements of your thought. In this session, we reviewed the elements of thought. In the next session, we will review the intellectual standards of critical thinking.